Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. It was an honor and privilege to receive the invitation. And while you just heard about psychophysiological mechanisms in stress and vascular functioning, I will focus on psychosocial stress. In doing so, I'll first briefly review the relationship between stress and health. I will then define stress from the perspective of the appraisal model of psychosocial stress, which will then offer implications for stress management, and I'll finish up with some future directions and potential conclusions.
It has been well established for decades that stress can have profound impact on many aspects of human health. For example, meta-analyses have established a robust and consistent positive relationship between stress and risk of upper respiratory infection, such that as stress increases, so does risk of upper respiratory infection. Additionally, a large body of evidence exists to show that stress significantly contributes to many aspects of CVD, from the atherosclerotic processes that underlie all of cardiovascular disease, to acute stress leading to myocardial infarctions, to childhood trauma, and the associated increase of CVD later in life. Indeed, an individual participant meta-analysis found that psychological distress can increase one's risk of mortality, and not just CVD mortality, but all-cause mortality. In fact, the profound and ubiquitous impact of stress on health, some have suggested stress should be considered as a social determinant of health.
So what is stress? In order to address the stress-health relationship, we have to know what stress is. From a mechanical or engineering perspective, stress is simply a load or challenge placed on a system. For example, in US clinical settings, a graded exercise test is often called a stress test, and that definition may work for purely physical stressors, but humans experience stress in profoundly different and distinct ways. And in the psychological literature, stress has been studied as a stimulus, as a response, and as a transactional process. So what do we mean by the transactional process? This idea was first developed by Lazarus and Folkman in the 80s, called the stress appraisal model, and it is undoubtedly the most influential model in the study of psychosocial stress and health. And from this perspective, stress is viewed as a transaction between the individual and the environment. And from this perspective, stress is defined as the perceived discrepancy between demands and response capabilities, where failure to meet those demands has important consequences. And a couple of important points to note here. One is that it's the perceived discrepancy between demands and response capabilities. It's not objective, it's perceived by the individual. It also involves the discrepancy between the demands and response capabilities. And finally, this applies to situations where failure has important consequences. So if you don't have important consequences, you don't have a discrepancy, you don't have stress. But the entire model hinges on this idea of perceived, what Lazarus and Folkman called appraisal being an evaluation. And so it's the perceived discrepancy between demands and response capabilities where failure has important consequences. This figure represents an oversimplified representation of the stress appraisal model, and it begins with a demand. It's placed on the individual, either an internal or external demand. Internal demand may be medical issue. External demands are things like work duties or family responsibilities. Those demands are then evaluated relative to one's perceived response capabilities. And they're appraised. Appraisal is simply an evaluation. If those stressors are deemed a challenge, that will result in some response. They're viewed as threatening, they can have different responses. Responses run the gamut of physiological responses, such as activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the HPA, the SAM, psychological responses like feelings of anxiety, depression, hostility, anger, and behavioral responses. Perhaps people exercise when they're stressed, or they seek out significant others for social support and talk to people, or others turn to drugs and alcohol, others become sedentary, and so on. So the appraisal or the evaluation dictates the subsequent response, which then has profound implications for health. Additionally, each of these can feed back on the process and alter the demand, the perception moving forward. But the key factor here is appraisals, perception or appraisal, how one evaluates that demand relative to their own response capabilities and the consequences that occur as a result of failure. This model has led to the integrated specificity hypothesis, which states that specific appraisals will lead to specific physiological and psychological responses. So again, how one appraises this demand relative to response capabilities will dictate subsequent physiological and psychological responses. And Denson and colleagues conducted a landmark meta-analysis, which included 66 studies of over 3,000 people. These studies were laboratory inductions of acute stress. So investigators typically would measure a host of variables prior to or at baseline, put participants then through some sort of stress induction procedure. These stress induction procedures include things like public speaking or performing an impossible math problem in front of others. And then they measure psychological and physiological variables at follow-up and then subsequent time points. In this particular case, studies focused on cortisol and immune responses, and the authors did in fact find found evidence that specific categories of appraisals were associated with specific immune responses. For example, cortisol was associated with challenge as well as fear of losing social approval, but not with global mood states like being happy or sad. Additionally, perhaps more interestingly, is that T lymphocyte responses were also found to have a differential pattern following stressful inductions. T lymphocytes being part of the specific or acquired or learned immune system, which typically takes several weeks to activate. And the authors found an inverse relationship between challenge and T lymphocyte response, novelty, as well as anticipation. And the authors argued that in times of challenge or new situations or situations involving anticipation, in other words, imminent types of challenges or threats, that specific immunity, at least this aspect of specific immunity, was down-regulated. Again, the reasoning is that for conservation of energy, this aspect of immunity would not be useful for immediate stressors. So taken together, this meta-analysis provides some compelling support for the idea that specific appraisals lead to specific physiological and psychological responses. So therefore, what then influences appraisal? And lots of different things can influence how someone perceives or evaluates the situation. Certainly personality factors can impact appraisal, things like type A personality or neuroticism. Certainly mental health or mental disease, the presence of anxiety or depression can certainly impact how we appraise or evaluate situations. Certainly past trauma, clearly post-traumatic stress disorder has profound implications for appraisal and stress. And most recently, researchers have studied the relationship of perceptions of control in the appraisal and stress process. Perceptions of control originally being conceptualized as things like locus of control or locus of causality, and more recently constructs like autonomy or competence or self-efficacy, all referring to perceptions of one's ability to control the factors that impact one's life. So what then is the implication for stress management? What do we do if appraisals are so important? What do we do then for stress management? How do we alter those? Well, what happens in the general stress process, again, this oversimplification, is that, again, stress results from the discrepancy between demands and response capabilities. In this case, demands are vastly exceeding response capabilities, and the result is a debilitating amount of stress. In contrast, a situation in which response capabilities vastly outweigh the demands, we may have a point of stress relief. And so in terms of stress management, what should we be targeting? Should we try to lower demands? Well, this may be very difficult unless, because we can't simply quit our jobs or get rid of our families, so reducing demands may be problematic. Maybe we need to increase our response capabilities, maybe get more help from other people, offload some duties to others, but that may not always be possible either. Or perhaps we can attack or alter perception, how people perceive these situations. Self-efficacy theory, developed by Bandura in the 70s and part of the larger social cognitive theory, offers great promise for stress management. Self-efficacy is defined as one's perceptions of one's ability to organize and execute the necessary courses of action needed to produce given attainments. It is one's perceptions of one's ability or perceptions of one's competence. It is thought of as a situation-specific perception of control. Self-efficacy has been found to be related to a number of different aspects of the stress process. Greater self-efficacy has been associated with reduced autonomic arousal after challenges, with lower cortisol responses to stress, as well as greater immunological functioning. Self-efficacy offers significant pathways on which we can build interventions to alter these perceptions of competence or these appraisal processes. The most powerful source of self-efficacy are performance accomplishments. Past success enhances one's efficacy. Failure reduces one's efficacy. Social modeling is also a powerful source of self-efficacy. Seeing other people successfully cope with stress or successfully perform a behavior enhances efficacy. Seeing similar other people fail will lower self-efficacy. Verbal persuasion, encouragement can enhance efficacy. Negative feedback can reduce efficacy. And then finally, interpretations of physiological experience related to affect or emotions and how we interpret what's happening in our bodies while we're doing a behavior. So positive feelings, positive affect, positive physiological signals enhance efficacy, and negative affect, painful signals can reduce self-efficacy. So if you want to impact the stress response, you enhance self-efficacy. The way to enhance self-efficacy is by targeting these different aspects of self-efficacy. So creating situations in which people can be successful, providing models, peer leaders to model good behaviors and can enhance self-efficacy. Providing verbal encouragement as opposed to negative or punishing feedback can enhance self-efficacy. And then helping people understand how physiological signals impact their own perceptions can all enhance self-efficacy and subsequently impact that stress response and make people better able to cope with the stress in their lives. From a completely different perspective, Mindfulness-based interventions have found to have great promise for stress reduction. Mindfulness being a foundational part of Buddhist philosophy and thought for thousands of years, recently brought to Western medicine by John Kabat-Zinn and others. Mindfulness, as defined by Kabat-Zinn, has to do with paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally, or the paying attention of internal thoughts, feelings, and sensations as they enter the attentional field, acknowledging them, and non-judgmentally letting them go. Mindfulness is thought to have two components, which is the regulation of attention and non-judgmental acceptance of whatever is observed. And so in mindfulness-based interventions, the idea is not to try to change anything other than the awareness that one has of one's own thoughts, feelings, and sensations. Based on these premises, Kabat-Zinn developed the mindfulness-based stress reduction therapy, which is a manualized, accepted form of stress reduction therapy. It's available all over the world. Typically involves 8 weeks of therapy in which the individuals engage in one group session per week, as well as 6 days of home practice per week. And the idea or the premise is that by intense focus on internal thoughts, feelings, and sensations, this will alter one's relationships with one's thoughts and inner experience. So in other words, just because I think I'm not capable of meeting this demand doesn't necessarily make it so. But by becoming aware of that thought, I can take control and respond in a more productive way. And there is tremendous support for mindfulness-based interventions, in particular MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Corey and colleagues published a meta-analysis of 30 studies, all randomized controlled trials testing the impact of MBSR and various indicators of psychological health. And they found moderate effect sizes across virtually all aspects of psychological health, including anxiety, depression, distress, and so on. All getting moderate effects around 0.6 or greater, indicating that this intervention, this approach to stress management might have great promise. And while these approaches offer great promise to new approaches to stress management, there's still a lot of unanswered questions. In terms of dose response, we do not know how much is required of an intervention in order to produce the desired stress-reducing effects. We don't know how much mindfulness meditation is required to produce the desired effects. We're not sure what the mediators of these effects are either. What is it about enhanced recognition or enhanced acknowledgement of your internal thoughts, feelings, and sensations that lead to reductions of stress? We don't know anything about interactions among mindfulness, self-efficacy, and physiological responses, as well as we're not aware of moderators. In other words, for whom may these interventions be best suited? Does it require a certain level of emotional maturity? So these interventions may be only useful for adults who have some level of maturity. We don't know how culture impacts these relationships as well. So in conclusion, in terms of the relationship of stress and health, it does seem clear that perception is critical. Perception of demands, perceptions of response capabilities are critical to the experience of stress. There is evidence that interventions that target these perceptions have great promise to reduce stress and improve subsequent health. And interestingly, the role of exercise, which I know is relevant to everyone here, is not well understood. There is some evidence that exercise can enhance physiological functioning involved in the stress processes, sometimes called the cross-stressor adaptation hypothesis. meaning that exercise, for example, may improve the efficiency of, say, the SAM and the HPA, which then can result in enhanced perceptions of capabilities and perhaps reduce stress reactivity. But we also know that stress or that exercise for some people is a stressor. For clinical populations, for sedentary people, for older adults, exercise may just be another stressor and not a stress reliever. Oh, thank you very much for your attention. Now that I'm done, I feel like my stress level has vastly decreased and I'm feeling pretty good. So thank you very much.